Hello everyone, my name is Blake Hamm and I have the privilege and slight terror of chairing the first panel of the conference. I'll introduce all four speakers at once and then we'll proceed in order with each of their respective presentations. Aileen Friesen is an assistant professor in the Department of History at the University of Winnipeg. She is also the executive director of the Plett Foundation and co-director of the Center for Transnational Mennonite Studies. She is also the editor of Preservings, an annual publication of the Plett Foundation. Her research interests include the history of Mennonites, especially their experience in the Russian Empire, the Soviet Union, as well as modern European history and the history of migration in the 19th and 20th centuries. Naemi was born in 1981 in Karaganda, Kazakhstan, while the Soviet Union was still existent. Karaganda was the place her family had been deported to in 1941, and her parents and grandparents were members of the Big MB Church in Karaganda. She spent the first years of childhood and primary school there. In 1993, the family moved to Germany and settled in Frankenthal, where she is an active member of the MB Church. She has studied history and literature at the Johannes Gutenberg University in Mainz from 2001 to 2007 and graduated with an MA degree. Afterwards, she worked as an editor in the Mennonite publishing company Salmonkorn from 2007 to 2018, where she took part in several research and publishing projects. From 2018 to 2021, she studied social work and is working as a social worker since her BA graduation, while completing her MA studies in social work and child protection part-time. Her historical research projects have been her main sideline occupation for many years now, and she has published articles of Mennonite history on topics of Mennonite history in the Aquila magazine. Nataliya Venger is a professor of history at Dnipro National University in Ukraine. She has defended 2 dissertations on Mennonite history. The first, Mennonite entrepreneurship on the Ukrainian lands of the Russian Empire between congregations, clans, and society, 1789 to 1917. The second is the collapse of the Mennonite community of Ukraine and foreign Mennonite aid, 1914 to 1931. She arrived in Canada as a refugee and has been a visiting scholar and research assistant at the University of Winnipeg since 2022. She is the author of 2 monographs and many articles on Mennonite, Ukrainian, Russian, and Soviet history. Olena Khodchenko will be presenting via Zoom today, and she holds a PhD from Dnipro National University in Ukraine, where she is an associate professor in the Department of World History. She defended her dissertation entitled The Mennonite Immigrants in the Social and Cultural Environment of North America in 2011 and has previously visited Winnipeg while conducting research on a Plett Foundation supported grant. Presenters, I'll give you a 2-minute warning. Thanks.
Thank you, Blake, for that introduction. I am going to time myself. See, I said I would be back, and here I am back. I didn't have to tell you anything in those other remarks because I was going to come right back up and say it here. Okay, so greetings again, everyone. And the title of my paper, or the title that I gave Ben way back, was Community Tensions and Migrations, Negotiating and Explaining an Exodus. And as I started to put together the actual paper, I thought, oh, well, that's actually a lot of information to get through in 15 minutes. So I won't manage all of it, but I wanted to highlight certain issues. So first of all, let's acknowledge that this topic has been investigated a lot. There has been a lot written about the 1870s migration. There's been a lot written about the reasons why, the push and pull factors that brought Mennonites from the Ukrainian lands of Imperial Russia to Canada, and a lot of debate, some of that debate embedded in tensions within the Mennonite community, sort of this idea like, we left because we had the truth faith, and those people who stayed behind, well, they were not faithful to Anabaptist principles. And then, let's be honest, and sometimes that there were echoes of that in the 1920s migration to Canada, like, oh, and now you guys show up after experiencing the terror of a revolutionary period in which there was so much loss. So there are all sorts of issues at play, and I wanted to investigate and delve into certain of those issues that I felt needed further interrogation. So let's just get some basic facts going. After the Crimean War and the death of Tsar Nicholas I and the coronation of Tsar Alexander II, the Imperial Russian state took on a series of reforms. These reforms were broad, and the purpose of them sometimes debatable. A lot of times they get sort of summarized in the term Russification, which really obscures more than it illuminates, because Russification has a lot of different meanings in a vast multi-ethnic empire, which was the Russian Empire. The idea of the Russian state officials transforming Mennonites into, quote, Russians was not really on the agenda of the imperial state officials. Although, interestingly enough, Abraham Thiessen, who's this renegade Kleine Gemeinde, he wrote a paper that sort of claimed that the Russian state was going to start sort of sending in Orthodox priests to convert Mennonites, which wasn't going to happen, but he has a very interesting take on the politics of religious identity that are on display during this reform period. Despite that claim, there were serious changes that were taking place to Mennonite position within the Russian Empire. So Mennonites had come in as colonists, and in 1871, that designation becomes part of the past, and Mennonites are then assigned to the settler proprietor category through an Imperial Russian state decree, which was not only for Mennonites, it was for also other colonists who had come in. This decree was published in both Russian and German. It's a nearly 90-page document that lays out the administrative structure that would then govern these former colonists, which includes the abolishment of the guardianship committee. And this document covers the new protocols of village assemblies, of these volist assemblies, of the volist courts. And for those people who were not able to adapt to this new circumstance, this ruling also gave them 10 years to leave Imperial Russia. Now, it should be noted that the regime did not negotiate a place to go to. They said, you can leave, but where to go to, that's another question. And the regime also didn't allow for other groups to come in to solicit settlers, right? So it's sort of like, you can leave, but we aren't going to give you avenues by which you can do that, but we will give you passports. Now, of course, the introduction of military service was one of the most significant factors in the Mennonite migration. But I want to focus on some of the other elements that often get lost during our talk about what facilitated this migration. So the creation of these the creation of volus, or these districts, these administrative changes, are very interesting, and they come about because there's also the emancipation of the serfs that takes place in 1861, and then this new administrative structure has to sort of incorporate all of the different peoples that are living there. The creation of districts for certain places didn't make a huge difference. So for instance, demographically, in Chortitsa colony comes Chortitsa Volist. It's still dominated by Mennonites, and there isn't really a ton of changes, although there is a shift towards multi-ethnic composition that will be taking place. Molochna as well. Molochna gets divided into two different districts, but it is Mennonite at its core, and hence the administrative structure just sort of adapts to this new circumstance, and the leadership is similar. But there were other places, in part because of the movement of Mennonites in the 1860s and the emancipation of the serfs and the selling off of certain estate lands or the renting of a certain estate lands. There was a movement of Mennonites to various places in the southern Ukraine region. And in those cases, in some of those cases, there was then now the integration of Mennonites with their Ukrainian and some Russian neighbors, in which now they administratively were being governed together. And the need to adapt to those new circumstances caused some consternation amongst certain groups, and opened up possibilities for others. And there's an interesting document of this one Russian Zemstvo activist called Kamensky, and he talks about, this is later on in the 1890s, the ways in which Mennonites were then integrated into these different volus that had these different multi-ethnic volus, and the leadership positions that some of them took in those volus, in those districts. And he's responding to someone else, so I kind of feel as if he's making it seem too good to be true a little bit, right? But he does make the claim that in some of these positions that Mennonites were being elected to those positions by their Ukrainian neighbors, by their Russian neighbors, and put into those positions. I think that we should be very careful about how we read that, but it is an interesting point. Now, not everyone was satisfied with this creation of these volus, even though Mennonites had taken on secular leadership for a while. So, as many of you know, the case of the Kleine Gemeinde, they sort of go back and forth on this issue. So initially, they say kind of no to these things, leading up to the administrative reforms, and then they say yes, and then once the administrative reforms start to happen, then they say no, we actually don't want anything to do with this. And one of the reasons why the Kleine Gemeinde and other groups are identifying this as a particular problem is also because of the formation of these volus courts. So there's these court systems that get put into place in which then sort of petty, or not petty, but like smaller claims will then be adjudicated by these various court systems, and it involves having Mennonites perform as judges. So interestingly enough, I was able to find a Russian publication looking at these volus courts, and it had a little section on the Chortitsa court. And so this is written in 1874. As many of you know, 1874 is the height, right, of the negotiations, the height of trying to figure out whether or not Mennonites will stay or go. And this describes the volus court in Chortitsa, which included 12 judges, 3 of whom would sit on the bench, and it would be replaced every 4 months. They heard court cases on Wednesdays. They could all read and write in German. However, only 3 of them could write in Russian, but all of them could speak the Russian language. And the proceedings would take place in German, but the decisions would be made in Russian. And so they heard sort of these minor offenses, and they could, the punishments available to the judges included community service for up to 60 days, a fine of 3 rubles, arrest for up to 7 days, and also for those who weren't exempt from corporal punishment, there could be the caning of up to 20 strokes. Interestingly enough, these judges argued that the ability to cane Russian workers for drunken and disorderly behavior was necessary. So they made that argument, which I think is something that needs to be looked into further, of how that affected relations with Ukrainian Russian workers working in those areas. So we find certain groups, obviously in Chortitsa, they went right into this court system. Like I said, 1874, also the same year that Edward Tutleben comes to the colonies in order to try to quell this emigration fever that had taken over. But other groups did not, and saw this as being problematic because, why? Well, of course, these issues, according to them, should be dealt with within the church. That these are church issues, and that they should be, it is the church governance that should be at work here, not the secular system. And so they refuse to participate in these venues. And it wasn't just the Kleine Gemeinde. There was also, if you read Johann Wieb's work, who will eventually become the Old Colony leader, it comes up there. It comes up in other places. And this is issue more, so military service is kind of number 1 if we're like ranking things. This is number 2, really. This issue is number 2. And raise it because a lot of times the issue of integration, of Russification, particularly of language, becomes the issue that people point to. And the issue of language politics is something to consider. And especially something to consider because, as many of us know, in 1922, there's an exodus of Mennonites from Manitoba to Mexico, and this is a lot to do with school politics. And so what do we see about the issue of language and the school system during this time if we're looking at actual documents and negotiations at that time? Well, first of all, we need to acknowledge that there is a varying degrees of language capacity among Mennonites during this period. So some are going to show capacity. They obviously speak German, Low German. Some will show capacity in Ukrainian. Some will show capacity in Russian. By 1820, we have Johann Cornys opening up a secondary school that is teaching Russian. The Guardianship Committee is going to encourage this, and we will have a school open in Hauptstadt and also in Chortitza in 1842. We will also have an estate, the Steinbach estate, Peter Schmidt's Steinbach estate, where Russian will be taught to children, including those of the Russian nobility. And interestingly enough, in 1838, David Epp, the minister of Chortitza colony, will drop off his son Heinrich at the Steinbach school to, quote, learn German and Russian. How do we know this? Because, as many of us have read, the David Epp diary exists, has been translated and published. And he described how every day students received 4 hours of language and 4 hours of instruction in both language. And he commends in his diary the school in Steinbach and also the school in Orloff for their work. Heinrich Epp, if we follow his trajectory, he will eventually become a teacher in the Chortitza Secondary School. He will also become sort of a district administrator. And he will be one of the people who goes on that first visit in 1871 to St. Petersburg in order to attempt to negotiate a different outcome for the introduction of military service. So this young man who has been trained in the Russian language, he is one of the 2 delegates who are appearing before imperial czarist officials who can speak Russian. There are some representatives from the church who cannot speak Russian. So he is there representing Mennonites and attempting to negotiate. Now, it's not only in the Chortitza church, obviously. The Kleine Gemeinde, also we have evidence of them teaching Russian language during this period. We also have evidence from Tutleben's visit to the Mennonite colonies in 1874 that Mennonites had right away adopted to writing in Russian language within their correspondence with the imperial government, and they had done so very quickly. This doesn't mean that there weren't issues surrounding language. I can point to other evidence that will help us think through this idea, and some of you are thinking in your head, well, Gerhard Wiebe has something on language in his book. I can talk about that later. I have run out of time. But I want to make one other point about this school issue. So yes, there was tension over the imperial state's desire to take over aspects of Mennonite schools, so schools will eventually be incorporated into the imperial system. If you have read the last couple of issues of Preservings, we pointed out the issue of singing, right? Singing versus just singing versus singing with numbers as being one of the issues that comes up in sort of debate about whether or not Mennonites have become too secular in their schools. But as I've been going through, and this will be my last point, as I was going through some of this documentation, particularly petitions from Mennonites to the imperial government, trying to explain what they want, what their qualms are with the imperial government's new reforms, what I found, and this is something that we often forget about, is a petition from the Hutterites. So the Hutterites, too, of course, at this period of time, are attempting to also negotiate. They are also against military service. They are also against participation in any district administration, although they are willing to give up their land in order to not have to participate in district administration, which is not something that Mennonites ever put on the table. But the Hutterites then start to describe their school system and why it's important to their community identity. And this is what I found was almost the embodiment of what becomes old colony values for schools is described in this document by the Hutterites about what the purpose of schools are: to teach children not to seek earthly things, to seek heavenly, spiritual things, which just helps us to think through a little bit more about the ways in which these groups might have interacted and the circulation of ideas that were taking place. But I have run out of my time, and so I will thank you, and I'll be open to a lot of questions hopefully after this.
So I'm very happy to be here in Canada. It's my first time actually here, and I'm very thankful to the CTMS for inviting me, for funding my trip. I'm very excited to meet many of you with whom I have been in touch for a long time. Now I see you face to face and to talk to you. And it's really amazing how many different kinds of Mennonites I've already met here in Canada, which has led to several discussions about what being a Mennonite really means. I'm not opening this box now, but my presentation is going to contribute a little bit to how these developments started, or of the origin of them. How can I?
Green.
Ah, the green one. Ah, okay. Yeah. So I'm talking about Mennonite spirituality in the mid-19th century. Please excuse me for my German pronunciation. I hope you understand me well enough. So first of all, I'll give some definition about what I mean by spirituality and the different kinds. So even though spirituality may be something individual, or we today may understand it individually, but we have basically two different kinds of spirituality among the Mennonites in the 19th century. They are described by different Mennonite historians as like traditionalist, or maybe conservative, or even legalistic. It's described as rigidly orthodox, averse to education, averse to cultural progress, and lacking deep piety. I mean, there are different descriptions of, for example, the kleine Gemeinde who fit this definition, and also the große Gemeinde, the big church. And there is another understanding of spirituality. It's, I'll call it innovative. It's what we call, I don't know if you're familiar with this description, but it's like spiritually awakened, or churches and individuals who are more open to influences, to spiritual influences from other awakened circles in Germany or in Russia, comparatively open to education and to mission, to foreign mission even, and who are practicing spiritual community, not just worship service on Sunday, but community where you talk about Bible, talk about spiritual life, and so on. So one example I want to give, we see the Molochna colony here, and it's this example is from 1858. Here is Orlov. We have what remains of the formerly große Gemeinde there. A big part of this church has left the church, so like 1/4 of the original church is left here, and the elder is Bernhard Fast, and he receives a letter from another preacher of the Schönsee congregation, who tells him that his church doesn't want him to preach anymore for two reasons. One reason is he sometimes visits other churches who are less conservative, and he subscribes the Barmer Missionsblatt. That's a paper issued by a missionary society from Germany. So he is like open to influence from outside, and that's why his church doesn't want him to preach anymore. And he writes this to Bernhard Fast and asks him to accept him into his church. And Bernhard Fasts accepts him, so this preacher, Aaron Rempel, joins the Orloff Church. And this seems to be typical for that time, that churches who are very conservative don't want those who are innovative, and they kick them out and they go to another church that's more innovative. And so by the mid-century we have all these different churches in the Molochna colony, which originally had only one church. And this is even without the MB, so this is before the Mennonite Brethren Church started. So that seems to be typical for Mennonites, even today. Yeah, so just to list all the churches that existed in the Molochna colony in around 1860. So some of the churches, as you see, Orloff Halbstadt, Kleine Gemeinde, Lichtenau Petershagen and Margenau Schönsee, they were founded by splits. And then there is the Rudnerweide Church and the Alexanderwold Church and the Gnadenfeld and the Waldheim Church, who have immigrated from Prussia as a complete community, settled in the Molochna colony and continued their community there. So these churches came later, as you can see by the years of immigration, and they brought new spiritual influences from the Pietist movement in Germany. So they kind of brought some kind of revival into the Molochna colony, which expanded to the other colonies as well. And the Pordenau Church and the Mennonite Brethren. So that's the list of the churches that are in the Molochna colony in 1860. Okay. So now just one definition or description of this traditionalist spirituality, which was given by Cornelius Wedel, a Mennonite historian. He says, for the most part, church life was limited to a service on Sunday mornings. As a rule, however, only a sermon copied from somewhere was read out. And this is a difference to the innovative spirituality. For them, it's important to have free sermons. So the preacher prepares a sermon on what he thinks is important, what he sees from the Bible, and then he preaches it. This is not what traditionalists do. They just read out sermons from sermon books. The Kleine Gemeinde pastor, Klaas Reimer, is writing his sermons by himself, but he reads them out to stick to this traditional rule. Then what Wedel also says is, the singing followed old worn-out tunes. It was only with difficulty that fixed melodies were introduced. There is the story historian Heinrich Goertz tells. He says that somebody visited his home church in Schönsee, his congregation, and he left it again annoyed with the singing, saying in German, das ist ja ein Geplärr, das dem Bösen davor graut. That means that's a whine the devil even would dread. So the singing is one point. Aileen already mentioned it, which had some, this innovative influence brought an innovation to the singing as well. I'll talk about that later if I have enough time. What Wedel says is there was a lot of dead orthodoxy as the church congregation coincided with the civic congregation. Some circles were only loosely connected to the congregation through church acts. Business was the main thing. So this is not what Mennonite church originally meant to be, because when the Mennonite church developed in the beginning, then it was a church of believers, of people who accepted Jesus Christ into their life and who wanted to lead a life as Jesus Christ. They were members of the Mennonite church. That was not not now in the Molochna colony, because now everybody who was born to a Mennonite family, he grew up, then he was baptized at the age of 18 to get married, so everybody was part of the congregation, be he a true believer or not. And that's what Wedel criticizes. And he also mentions those searching souls who were quietly searching, and they also knew how to nourish their inner life from the meager proclamation of salvation from good writings. So he mentions writings, and this was a main, a very important method of how influence from the Pietists came to the Mennonites. Okay, so just some quotes from original Anabaptists, how they understood being a church member or a true Christian. So the quote of Hans Denk from 1526, "No one can truly recognize Christ unless he follows him in life. Whoever thinks he belongs to Christ is obliged to live as Christ lived." So that was the original understanding of Christianity. And Menno Siemens also viewed the church as a society of born-again Christians. So, okay. There's another quote of, something went wrong. Okay, another quote of an elder, Heinrich Unruh, who describes how the church has been in his youth. He was born in 1845, so he was a teenager around the 60s. He says, "There were few poor people in need of support, and they received their support from the congregation. At that time, there was a real community charity among us." So he's talking about the mutual care. Mennonites had several institutions that regulated this mutual care. For example, the Waisenamt for the orphan care, and things like Brandschutzordnung, that means some kind of for people who were victims of fire or water damage. Yeah, they helped. An insurance. That was the word I was searching for. Okay, but then Unruh says, admittedly, the customs, especially among the young people, were quite crude. Very little was done for education and Christian upbringing. Reading foreign books was considered dangerous to the soul. Only the Bible, hymn book, catechism, Menno's Fundamentbuch, strangely enough found only among the members of the Kleine Gemeinde, and at best the Wandelnde Seele, which is a Bible story book or an interpretation of Bible stories, were considered permissible. So here's some of the pictures: a hymn book, this Fundament book of Menno Siemens, and this book with Bible stories. Those were allowed for the conservative traditional churches. And then through this influence from the Pietist movement, writings of the Pietists came into the Mennonites, and this sermon book of Ludwig Hofacker, Lutheran pastor from Stuttgart, who was very well known in his surrounding. People came from far and wide to hear his sermons, and his books. He died at the age of 30, so he was not able to come to the Molochna colony himself, but his books came, and many people read his books and were influenced by them. And in Germany, his books still are being read. I worked in a bookshop some years ago, and people bought his books still today. So I mentioned Bernhard Fast in the beginning, Elder Bernhard Fast. He was, for his time, a very innovative pastor of a Mennonite church. He wanted to bridge the gap between Flemish and Frisian Mennonites. So when he was ordained in 1821, he asked the elder of the Frisian congregation, so he was from a Flemish congregation, and he asked the elder of a Frisian congregation to do the ordination. And this was a big part of his church opposed against this and didn't like that. So he also encouraged and supported Johann Corny's efforts. He promoted the foundation of the Bible Society in Halbstadt. He supported a new type of school that was going further than the basic education. So in the end, 75% of his church left in 1824, and so that was the new big church, and he remained with those who were okay with this innovative things he was doing. And he was an elder for about 40 years. And when the Mennonite Brethren Church split off, so he was one who didn't join the Mennonite Brethren Church, but who supported it and who was against this conflict that arose there in the Molochna colony. So I'm running out of time. So just a short overview. There was a teacher from Prussia who came and who introduced some kind of Christian community life in the colony. He introduced gatherings where free prayer was practiced. So people didn't just pray those prayers they knew by heart, but they could just like freely pray to Jesus. That's what he taught them. He introduced missionary gatherings where he informed people about foreign missions and where they donated for missions. They had handicraft circles for missions and so on. They were reading and discussing spiritual writings. They were even publishing spiritual writings. And so what he introduced to the colony was, in German, we call it Brudertum, so some kind of brotherly fellowship. Then the Gnadenfeld Church came, and it even increased this level of community, of Christian community to the colony. And with different kinds of spiritual gatherings, with alcohol abstinence, practice of blessing the children. So Gnadenfeld became the new center of Christian fellowship life. So preacher Eduard Wüst, but you probably know about him because he was the one who preached a lot and finally ignited the emerging of the Mennonite Brethren Church. The singing, this numeric system for singing and four-part singing was introduced by teacher Heinrich Franz. Okay, it's just an example. Whoever is interested in it, I can give it to you later. It's just an example of a so-called searching soul. Justina Harder, who was the wife of Elder Johann Harder, who succeeded Bernhard Fast in the Orloff Church. It describes her spiritual struggle, how she struggled from being just from living out rules of her education to finding what she called true faith in Jesus Christ, and so she found it on her sickbed before she died. So I can give it to you, whoever is interested later. Okay, that was her husband. We have no picture of her. Okay, thank you.
Oh, no.
May the guys and help me with this question. Okay, I will start and facilitate this presentation. The topic of my presentation is social adaptation and characteristic of preserving ethno-cultural identity among Mennonite immigrants of the 1870s. As a study based on the zero adaptation and acculturation and analyzes the variety of the stages of Mennonite immigrants integration into the Canadian society, and to understand the causal link of this process, we will briefly address the motives behind the Mennonite immigration from Ukrainian lands in the 1870s. The Mennonite communities that immigrated to the south of Russia in the 18th century established compact settlements under church leadership. All aspects of life were subordinated to religious doctrines with organized governments by families. Interaction between the community and the government was regulated by the instructions of the guardianship office for foreign settlers. With the onset of capitalist transformation in society, the Mennonite communities were forced to change their views on participating in national process and relations with their authorities. Some communities promoters of isolationism sought to preserve not only religious but also economic autonomy. Other groups wished to integrate into the broader social economic process. As a result, social, immigrant, and non-communities members began to manifest more frequently. The group plans of the Alexander II were one of the triggers for the ideas of immigration from Russian Empire. Under the new legislation, Mennonites lost their status as foreign settlers, and they were required to perform military service. The new measures committed to isolationist nations to ardently seek ways to immigrate in order to preserve the spiritual traits of their society. The purpose and destination for immigration were the lands of the Canadian domain of Canada and the United States. In the 1870s, the countries were actively campaigning for migrants in order to develop, cooperate, and involve their frontier regions of the works in economic process. The first Mennonites who arrived in New York and Philadelphia came under the influence of American immigration agents. As a result, some Mennonites who in Shetland intended to immigrate to the Dominion were spoiled by the agents and settled in the United States. As a result, communities of the Alexander, Khodchenko, Rima, and a small part of land demanded settlement in the United States. Overall, the communities that sought to establish isolated settlements to preserve their traditional way of life using their religion beliefs went to Canada. This included the Alberta, Friesen, and Naemi. Upon arriving to Canada, the Mennonites had a wide choice of plans for settlement. However, community leaders, Peter S. and Herbert chose to establish colonies in the sparsely populated area of Ottoman south of Winnipeg. The Canadian government, eager to secure its frontier lands in the United States and culture, was willing to make a significant concessions to the organized group of immigrant settlers. As a result, the government allocated a region exclusively for Mennonite settlements, including the result of additional lands for future settlers. The Mennonites were exempted from military service and taken oaths, and the government guaranteed no interferences in the religious life and the educational process. As amendment was even made to the Dominion Act, allowing Mennonites to live in the settlement with a communal ownership and land use. Now I would like to speak about the economic development and the facilitation of the immigrants and first lands and areas of Manitoba, compared very similar to the Ukrainian states. However, the cold season lasted about 2 months longer, the rainfall pattern was different and there were more snow. The settlers' first priority was housing, which was form of the temporary fields called the guards. The settlements were clearly similar to those where the hunting Ukraine, with attention to equal access to water source. The first years were difficult for the migrants, and they avoided from mine in winter by receiving government loan on $92,000 guaranteed by Venger from Nataliya. In the next rainy season, the colonists learned from their past year's experience. They started sowing later at the end of May. They plowed less deeply, which reduced labor costs. And at the same time, many settlers were this is despite the poor quality of the land and the into their walls. As a result, as a Mennonite request, a second plot of land was located for the East Reserve. The third small colony was established on Swedish River. Now I would like to speak about the organization of social life in the colonies, and as in Russia, the General Assembly elected the overshoes who was granted authority over the overall management of economical activities. The church, while overseeing religious and political governments, did not interfere in economic activities, but inspired social programs such as fire insurance system, the protection of orphan interest, and oversaw school education. It also regulated the distribution of property based on family equality principles. In 1877, 26 settlements were founded, and the hardship of the first years were gradually overcome, proposing prosperity began to grow. By the 1877, the harvest and livestock numbers fully met the needs of the colonists. Over time, industry also began to develop, particularly timber, so we had rural living, and so the settlers successfully and quickly adapted to the economic challenge. The excellent organization and governments of the colony, along with the settlers' strong work ethic, allows them to adapt to natural and economic conditions very soon. This progress was achieved against the backdrop of a general economic depression during which many farms went bankrupt. And Icelandic settlers in the Uni area and Scots in Manitoba and Khodchenko experiencing failures. The Mennonite achievements and impressive government officials, the Mennonites who had not yet obtained citizenship were even invited to participate in the parliament elections. In 1877, the 3-year term of the first settlers ended, and they were eligible for citizenship. However, Mennonites hesitate to pursue citizenship or participate in elections. They feared that naturalization and political environment involvement would lead to the loss of their traditional self-government, obliged them to follow Canadian laws and make them part of their national system. They also worried about being subject of the labor court, which could undermine their communal system. Despite the government's reassurance that the commitments made to the Mennonites would remain unchanged, the settlers chose not to take advantage of their potential influence on Manitoba legislation. Self-isolation was satisfactory for most Mennonites. Despite the Mennonites' reluctance to cooperate, the Manitoba government continued efforts to integrate Mennonites into public life. In October 1878, the Protestant section of the Minister of Education proposed to register Mennonite private schools as public schools, offering subsidies of $80, while promising not to interfere with the education process. Understanding that education was a priority for the state, Peter tells the leader of the kindly minded community and recommended that his brethren accepted the military offer. As a result, in 1882, 6 districts of the East Reserve had public schools under church control. However, the gradual group in this colony viewed the introduction of public schools negatively, so only one district opened such a school, while others remained private. The next government action that affected the Mennonites was the administrative reform reform. In 1879, an act was passed dividing the region of Manitoba into municipalities with an administrative elected by the population, responsible for local infrastructure, taxes, and statistical correctness. In Italian community did not recognize the reform and did not participate in the elections, allowing the Western community to manage the municipality. The West resort was divided in two municipalities, Friesen and Douglas, and the Khodchenko community, which lived in the West resort, continued to live and operate under its own government system. Those a dual authority was established in the West resort, although the relationship between the leaders of the municipality and the Friesen were quite harmonious, and they joined government with the municipality until the 1920s. The construction of the railway was an utmost importance for the integration of the Mennonite communities into Canadian society, and in 1879 the railway connected Winnipeg with the state of Minnesota, and then the line passes from Mennonite lands. And all these changes connecting with the railway, changes the social and economic landscape in close proximity to the Mennonite settlements. Changes led to diversions of the adjustment of the ethical norms accepted in the community, resulted in the fragmentation of the church. This fragmentation was promoted by the missions of the Western Mennonites, as well as the strengthening of the dominions in internal politics, regarding the language of instruction and protection of private Mennonite schools. As a result, the Canadian Mennonite congregation split off the statement community in 1897 and a group of followers of Olena in 1882. The Berkeley community in 1892 was divided into three churches. The eastern group was Fortis and the western group Summerfeld. The third group retains the name Nataliya. The Fortis and Summerfeld communities had the same ideological platform of minimal cooperation with municipal authorities, and in order to preserve the purity of religion, some of these schools migrated to Saskatchewan in the middle of the 1890s. In 1888, a group from the Khodchenko community separated and fully accepted the norms of Canadian society, while part of the main church too migrated to Saskatchewan. Thus, by the 1923, the main group of like-minded adapted to society at the stage of segregation or mutual tolerance. The stable community reached the stage of accommodation or adaptation. The Berkshire in the East Reserve was at the stage of accommodation, while part of the Summerfeld and Fortis in Manitoba was at the stage of segregation. Personland in Manitoba was also at the stage of segregation, and Winnipeg was at the stage of integration. This failed to adapt included part of the Summerfeld Church, Fortis and Khodchenko, which immigrated to Mexico in 1921. Thank you for your attention. It's very pity that you couldn't look my presentation. So I hope that in the future you will have this possibility. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. So it's my first time when I participate in this kind of event. It's an annual event that is very atmospheric. So I love it because always it's additional opportunity to meet people, to discuss, to share knowledge, and what is important sometimes, especially for presenters, to surprise to surprise the audience with some new information. So coming for the conference, I always ask myself what I'm going to surprise people. And it is not difficult for me because I'm Ukrainian historian and I can tell you much about, Russian imperial and Ukrainian background. And today I'm going to introduce you some people who are maybe important for the Mennonite list of good Russians, good Russian nobility, I mean. So the people who really supported Mennonite in the Russian Empire, and especially at this crucial period of pre-immigration period. And my today's presentation is Unsuccessful Compromise, Russian Nobility in its discussion about possible Mennonite immigration. It is 71, 73, not 74. According to the Ministry of State Domain and David Rempel's calculation, about 18,000 Mennonites immigrated from the Russian Empire to the New World in 1874. This exodus became a significant turning point in Mennonite history, overcoming regional boundaries and causing a public outrage. For the Mennonites, immigration disputes of 1874, 71, 74 was a culmination of tensions. The fact that a significant number of Mennonite population made a decision to stay in Russia was the result of a compromise between the Mennonites and the Russian elite. How was this compromise achieved? Or more precisely, who made it possible? Who made it possible? There is an opinion that the Mennonites were skillful negotiators and secured new concessions during the discussion about the new military statute. Accepting this true, I suggest contemplating the statement that some support from the local Russian elite was a crucial precondition in achieving the compromise between the Mennonites and Russian society. To start with, let's understand why Mennonite needed that support. First, the Mennonite negotiations in St. Petersburg with representatives of the central nobility were unsuccessful. Second, the military statute committee ignored the congregation's demands. That is why the Mennonites really needed the support from the local nobility who knew the Mennonites. I am aware of 5 attempts of negotiations initiated by the Mennonites, as well as several written petitions were submitted by them. They managed to meet with Senator Oettinger, Baron Madam from the Ministry of State Domains, Count Haydn, who chaired the commission for drafting the statute, Minister Pyotr Valuyev, and Grand Duke Konstantin Nikolaevich. During a brief meeting with the Empress, the Mennonites handed over their petition to her. The Mennonites aimed to persuade the Tsar and the government to retain their privileges. But this goal was not achieved in 1871-73. There was a lack of, how to come back? There was a lack of understanding and compromise among the both parties, language barriers and unwillingness to make concessions and find solution. Baron Madam was surprised that the representatives of the colonies couldn't speak Russian. The Mennonites literally broke off the dialogue with Haydn, declaring their uncompromising position, and the Russian officials told them to look for another country. Great Duke Konstantin Nikolaevich was ready to present the Mennonite petition to the Tsar and asked them how about military medical units. When the Mennonite rejected them, he darkened, discontinued, took the petition, and dismissed the deputies. The negotiations often involved deputies with more radical position that gave a wrong impression of the Mennonite congregations as a whole. Unfortunately for the Mennonites, they never received a direct answer. So I need to come back. Can I come back? No, this is, sorry, I'm sorry. Some technical. So Mennonites never received a direct answer, but only a vague assurance. Finally, in their petition, the Mennonites did not provide their constructive suggestions. They more demanded than negotiated. Thus, the position of the two parties, the Mennonites and the government, couldn't be breached through their negotiations. Because of this, the Mennonites were unable to influence the work of the Statute Commission. That commission operated in 1870-1874 at the very time when the Mennonites were dispatching the deputation writing petitions. The minutes of its activity can be studied with the diaries by Pyotr Valuev, the Minister of Internal Affairs, and Dmitry Milutin, the military minister. Milutin reported that the issue was not discussed before autumn of 1874. So Mennonites were negotiating since 1871, but for 2 years, those negotiations were just transparent, invisible for the society. Why was the commission so indifferent to Mennonites' issue? Military Minister Dmitry Milutin provides his answer to these questions in his diary. Because the colonists' request was perceived by the commission as a secondary issue. On October 31st, when Milutin wrote, "Only among the Crimean Tatars and in some colonies the talks about immigration arise. I hoped that this local, isolated opposition will not frighten us and will not cause our concessions." So efforts to discuss the Mennonite matter were made only between October 31st and January 1st, when the statute was adopted and published. It means that published statute didn't contain any concessions for the Mennonites in the text. This preliminary observation must convince us again that Mennonite delegation and petition didn't yield the expected results. However, despite this disregard for the problem posed by the Mennonites, the first attempts to develop the draft of the future alternative service law were made before October 1873. Pavel Kotzebue, the governor of Novorussia and Belarusian provinces, played a crucial role in supporting the Mennonites. In fact, Pavel Kotzebue represented the local nobility interested in Mennonite presence in the region. At that time, the nobility of Ukrainian provinces actively interacted with the Mennonites. The members of congregation traded with them, were the suppliers of agricultural products and artisan goods for them, and also Mennonites bought the land which nobility wanted to sell after the unsuccessful for them abolition serfdom reform. In addition, it is known that the nobility itself strongly opposed the new military statute. They were not satisfied with the fact that under the new statute, they were given equal rights with the peasantry, who had been recently their serfs. The local governor, General Kotzebue, who was also a military man, was responsible for the economic development of the region. He valued the Mennonites as an important social resource. When the Mennonite approached Empress Maria Alexandrovna in Crimea, she turned the Kotzebue, asking for his expert opinion. So, since the summer of 1871, Kotzebue was involved in discussion, influenced the course of the conflict, and had a lot of conversation with the less radical leaders of the colonies. For the Mennonites, Kotzebue proved to be the most effective channel in the communication with the Tsar and the minister. In his first letter to Empress, he put forward some ideas for normalization the conflicts, initially suggesting to replace military service with a tax. In the same letter, he strongly supported the Mennonites, and as the master of the region, he considered it advisable to keep the Mennonites in the empire. On the other hand, he was a Russian bureaucrat. Kotzebue opposed maintaining permanent exemption status for the Mennonites because other estates are involved into military service. In his letters, 1871-1873 to the emperor and to the ministers, he suggested some alternatives, which, as he thought, could be accepted by the Mennonites. To implement Mennonite tax, to provide 12-year deferment to change the Mennonites for this period, alternative service in shipyard, hospitals, and forestry teams, to provide Mennonites with the opportunity to serve in Mennonite units under the supervision of religious leaders and congregations. Questions: where did Kotzebue generate these ideas? Yes, that they were later used for the law. Firstly, they may have arisen from direct communication with the Mennonites. For example, he mentioned Mr. Friesen, the head of Berdyansk District Zemstvo Board. Additionally, that is important, he offered to apply some already existed practice to the Mennonite case. For example, the divisions of Jews craftsmen in the Russian army. The young men who were called up to these artisan teams didn't touch weapons and were responsible for providing the army with certain craft products. So he didn't invent anything. He just used the existing practice. Kotzebue's ideas were supported by Count Shuvalov, who proposed to call up the Mennonites to the penitentiary system. Also, he explained the reason why the Mennonites were afraid to speak only about their desirable alternative service. Because I said that Mennonites more demanded than negotiated. Why didn't they say what they wanted exactly? Count Shuvalov, they are wary that any document outlining their alternative proposals will be regarded by their descendants as apostasy and a betrayal of their pacifist view. In January 1873, Kotzebue addressed to the Minister of Internal Affairs, Timashov. In this letter, Kotzebue protested against the ineffective action of the minister, who used intimidation tactics toward the Mennonites. He told, "Recently, disturbance has rematched among the Tavrida Mennonites. It happened because the Colonel Alexander Bartholomew visited the colonies, intimidated the Mennonites, and addressed the settlers with some demands and foolish jokes. Probably the Mennonite didn't understand their jokes and began selling their property, once again considering immigration from Russia." So not only Totleben, but one more personality visited colonies. As follows from Timashov correspondence, the Minister of Internal Affairs himself didn't support Kotzebue, Shuvalov, and Mennonite issue. In 1874, he prepared a report. So coming back to land issue, Aileen mentioned. He prepared different conspiracy interpretations of the reason of Mennonite immigration. In Timashev's view, Mennonite allegedly wanted to profit engaging in land speculation. The Mennonites wanted to buy out the land granted to them by Tsar and then to sell them at much higher prices. Similar warning about land speculations are also found in a note by Baron Mendel from the Ministry of State Domains. Also, Khodchenko didn't share this point of view. He confirmed that their law of 1871 did not restrict Mennonites' rights to buy the land and renounce Russian subjecthood. Additionally, as governor, he had no legal means to deny the Mennonites their foreign passports. It seems that Khodchenko, who wanted to prevent the immigration, was deliberately escalating the situation surrounding the Mennonite departure to pay more attention to this event. Yeah, just 2 minutes, 1 minute. In February 1874, officials in St. Petersburg received a telegram stating that the Mennonites were requesting passports to leave Russia in large numbers. Consequently, Totleben mission was planned. Speaking with the Mennonite, Totleben conveyed proposals on behalf of the Tsar. But what I wanted to explain in my presentation, the Tsar was not the author of those proposals. They were drafted by the governor and military general Pavel Khodchenko. Thank you.
Thank you to all presenters, and now we can entertain some questions for all, and I believe there are microphones going around the room.
Hi, thanks for, I couldn't hear very well, but I got the gist of it. My question is to the lady in the blue dress. Again, English names give me a problem. You said that the Russian government said you can leave but didn't tell you where to go. Is that correct? Did I hear that right? So my question is, how did you end up here? Like what decision-making process brought you to Canada and to Manitoba?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the Canadian government was interested in colonizing this, the prairies, and we're looking for settlers. And they sent representatives along with the Americans who are also interested in colonizing, and identified this group as a potential group that could go to those lands. The Russian state wasn't interested in having people come and take their own settlers, but that is the process by which it happened.
Last question. In our language, we call German-speaking people, and what I understand now, bearded people. Did the people that come here the first time have beards?
No, they did not, but interestingly enough, in other, I know that there are Indigenous people in Alberta as well who use similar language in order to describe Mennonites as bearded people, and so there's been some debate about whether or not they're describing Hutterites. Hutterites didn't come into this territory until after World War I, so I don't actually know where that would have come from and what that, if it was something that evolved or if that was something that was originally, so they weren't, but obviously they were called that by your people, so.
When we started calling them that, we're not sure. We don't measure time in the way Western thinkers measure time. There were 3 words that described the sound of your language, because that's the way we didn't know it was German or Low. But we did use 3 words to describe those kind of people, and I think Ukrainians were included in that. So bearded people was one of them, was one of those words. Who had beards, I don't know. We don't know that. So I was just wondering, but I've seen pictures of people with beards. Did they shave them off before they get here?
Conrad Stace is our expert on mustaches and bearded, the rules of beardedness in Mennonite communities, but apparently Yeah, beards were something that had to be dealt with according to church rules.
Hi there. I guess this would probably be a question for Dr. Fast on Mennonite spirituality. I don't think anyone's accused me ever of being a traditionalist, but I couldn't help, and I understand the language that you used seemed internal to the Mennonite, like you were giving perspectives from within the Mennonite context. It seemed very loaded, sort of what we come to see as sort of a modern liberal bias against anything that might smack of ritual or sort of that sort of closeness. I'm just wondering if there's been any more recent kind of reassessments of that sort of division and reassessments of some of the maybe the limitations of the innovative and some of the strengths of the traditionalist spiritualities in the mid-1800s, if that makes sense.
So you want to know if there is modern research about that, or about that?
Sorry, the language just felt very loaded in one direction in terms of interpreting the situation there, and I'm just wondering if there's if there's been reassessments of Mennonite spirituality from that time in terms of a qualitative, more qualitative assessment of those spiritualities.
Yeah, there probably is, but it's, the sources I used are actually from within the Mennonite circles. So yeah, I didn't have the time to go over to that. Yeah.
Thanks.
Question over here. Nothing upstairs from Jeremy, but a question down here, down the aisle.
Thank you to all presenters. It was lovely to hear your presentations. I have a question for Dr. Fast, and it's maybe overly simplistic, but when you talk about innovative versus traditionalist spirituality, is the roots of the GCMB split found in that different perspective?
What do you mean, the GC what?
The General Conference
the General
split
Conference.
and B split, can that directly, indirectly be found in those two different views of spirituality?
Yeah, actually, if to keep it simple, it's just the General Conference is the traditionalist one, and the Mennonite Brethren Church is the innovative one. So to say it very simply.
We had a question upstairs.
I'm wondering a bit about the category of colonists changing to settler proprietors. So this is more of a question for Aileen, I suppose. I'm wondering how that connects, or if it connects at all, to the selling off of estates or the acquisition of estates in Imperial Russia, and just how those changes in kind of policy related more broadly to kind of changes in land acquisition.
Yeah, Nataliya can also help with this question. So they aren't necessarily, they're related but not related. So in the it's the emancipation of the serfs that's going to open up the possibility for the selling of estates because of the Russian nobility's inability to, or some of them, their inability to farm the land without forced labor in essence. And so that is going to be a larger factor. The emancipation of the serfs will be a larger factor. But as Nataliya mentioned, 1871 meant that the ownership of the land was now being held by the individuals who could then sell land potentially, and sell land not only within Mennonite circles but also in certain cases outside of that. And so you'll see the transfer of land to other places. And they had to wait 3 years in order to get that, and that is why you see, so in 1871 it comes into place, the law comes into place, and then 3 years later you have some groups that are wholesale selling the land right away, even before negotiations with the Tsar estate have concluded. And when Tatleben goes to visit, he's like, okay, these people have already sold and they're already like mentally gone, so we don't have to worry about those ones because it's already done for them. And so that created the possibility. So that's where the ownership of the land, I think, is more relevant for the colonists. And then for the other group, it's about more of the nobility. But Nataliya might want to add to that.
Probably you told everything general was said actually. So I can add actually that in 1861 in Russia it was also one of the great reform, the reform of abolition of serfdom. And that is why the local nobility had a great problem with labor forces on their fields. And even at the time, it was put forward a new idea, and local nobility asked the government, let us arrange one more colonization. Yeah, they spoke about that. So let's invite somebody from abroad. But, you know, it was not time for colonization already, because Russia was passing through the period of modernization. That is why local nobility who came across with these difficulties. So they had a lot of lands, but they couldn't, to liberate them. So they wanted to sell their lands, and the Mennonites were ready to buy. So that is how it was going on at that time.
I think we have time for one more question. Sure, up front here.
This is a question for the last presenter, and we discussed several Russian nobles who were instrumental or who had some affecting role in settling the negotiations between Russian nobility and the Mennonite situation. My question is, how much of an issue were the Mennonites for the Russian nobility at large? What was their general perspective? And what was that even talked about in those circles?
Thank you for this question. It's very important, actually. So if you say about Russian nobility, it was a united, body. Yes, Russian nobility. I told about local nobility. Local nobility were familiar with Mennonite because they cooperated with Mennonites. They knew people, yes, and they had different attitude to your neighbors. Your neighbors are all mostly good for you, yes. But if you live somewhere, maybe 600 kilometers from Ukraine, far in St. Petersburg, you just read newspapers, you don't know people. So that is why I said that when Mennonite negotiated with the central nobility, with the imperial nobility, ministers and officials, so it was always difficult to Mennonite to find common sense. But when the Mennonites spoke with the local nobility, it was good. But if we say about the prospect, about the modernization, again, about the nationalism, so historical perspective was negative for the Mennonites. And that is why I called my presentation Unsuccessful Compromise. It was successful when it was Russian government and Khodchenko managed to leave some people to stay, Mennonite people to stay in Ukraine, but and it was positive compromise. But if you say about historical perspective, it was bad because later, especially in St. Petersburg, and propagandists, a lot of nationalists, they will remind about that Mennonite refused to be military men, refused to protect their motherland. So they are lack of patriotism. That was the main thesis, and this thesis was used by both supportive Mennonites and of course those who were against the Mennonites. And this thesis was used not only in the Russian Empire but also by the Bolsheviks. It survived. It was a stereotype. So the people who didn't leave, they were fed off all this problem that was because of this immigration.
Can I just add one quick comment? So Mennonites are aware of some of the things being said about them, and one of the ways in which they are trying to create support is through the other means in which they helped in various military campaigns. And so the Russian imperial state officials are very much aware of what happened during the Napoleonic Wars. Crimea War came up quite often in those types of debates because of the ways in which Mennonites rendered service for Crimean War. And then the Russo-Turkish War happens right away in 1877 to 78. And once again, Mennonites are having hospitals, are making donations. So this becomes part of their internal response to the types of critiques that are being laid out by others around them.
Thank you.
Thank you for your questions. That concludes our first panel. We'll have a quick coffee break. There's refreshments in the back, and we will be back here for our second panel at 11. Thank you.